Zuri adjusted the strap of her sleek black dress and took a deep breath as she stepped into the buzzing office party. The lights gleamed off polished floors, glasses clinked, and laughter floated in the air, but none of it reached her. Tonight, she wasn't just attending a gathering, she was entering a stage set for scrutiny. Her husband Okechukwu, already known for his sharp tongue, was hosting the party, and she could feel the weight of every colleague's gaze. It didn't take long for him to strike. With a smirk that carried the ease of cruelty, he leaned toward a cluster of colleagues and said loud enough for Zuri to hear, "She really does nothing, always a burden, and yet somehow here." A few forced chuckles followed, and Zuri felt the heat rise to her cheeks. Her heart thudded, and for a fleeting moment, the room seemed to shrink around her embarrassment. But behind the tightening in her chest, a spark ignited. She refused to shrink. Every mocking word, every dismissive glance only fueled a quiet, unshakable resolve. Zuri reminded herself that this was not the measure of her worth. She had ambitions, ideas, and capabilities that stretched far beyond Okachukwu's narrow view. Tonight might have been his stage, but she was already planning her own act, a revelation that would make even his colleagues see her different. As she smiled politely and joined the conversation, Zuri's mind was already racing. He thought he humiliated her. He had no idea the storm she was quietly preparing. Zuri remembered the early days of her marriage, the way Okachukwu's words could cut deeper than any insult she'd ever known. It wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was just a sigh of disappointment, a dismissive glance, or a joke meant to humiliate her in front of friends or family. "You're lucky to have me," he would say, as if her value depended entirely on his approval. He belittled her at dinner parties, in casual conversations, even when they were alone, always questioning her choices, her ambitions, and her intelligence. Over time, the constant small jabs left invisible bruises, a quiet erosion of confidence he assumed she could never rebuild. But Zuri's world outside their home told a very different story. At work, she was the one people turned to for advice, the one who solved problems others couldn't, the one who could negotiate deals with patience, precision, and poise. Her friends admired her intelligence, her colleagues respected her creativity, and anyone meeting her for the first time would never suspect the shadow of doubt her husband tried to cast over. They saw a woman in control of her life, a woman who was thriving. This public perception and Okachukwu's constant contempt were like two parallel worlds, colliding in ways he didn't understand. What he didn't know, what he never suspected, was how quietly Zuri had built her own empire behind closed doors. She had investments he thought she didn't care about, business connections he assumed were meaningless, and contracts and deals she managed without his input, or even his awareness. Late at night, when Okechukwu was distracted or asleep, she reviewed spreadsheets, negotiated with clients, and strategized her next moves. Every careful decision, every calculated risk, was hers alone, and slowly, almost invisibly, she was creating a power he had never imagined. It was a life of contradictions, a woman seen as fragile by her husband, yet unstoppable in her own right. Zuri had learned to wear a mask of patience and quiet endurance around Okechukwu, while nurturing ambition and independence in the shadows. She had discovered that strength didn't have to be loud to be devastating. And every time he tried to diminish her, she reminded herself of the growing world he would one day realize she commanded. Looking back, she saw how his dismissiveness had shaped her, not into submission, but into careful strategy. She had turned humiliation into motivation, derision into determination. The world outside their marriage had given her a stage to shine, even if Okechukwu would never be the audience she wanted to impress. And in that quiet, invisible work, she was preparing for a moment when he and everyone else would finally see her true worth. The office party was in full swing, a glittering display of wealth and influence that made the corporate world feel larger than life. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a soft glow over tables dressed with fine linens and sparkling crystal glasses. Waiters moved gracefully through the crowd, carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. High-ranking executives laughed and shook hands, their polished shoes clicking on the marble floors. The air buzzed with ambition, small talk, and the subtle tension of people trying to impress and be noticed. Okechukwu moved through the room with his usual swagger, his voice just loud enough to draw attention. "Yes, we closed that deal last quarter," he said, puffing his chest with pride. "It was a huge success. Everyone here knows it was my leadership that made it happen." He laughed a little too proudly and gestured toward his colleagues as if expecting applause. Around him, heads nodded, smiles polite but slightly wary, sensing the arrogance that always seemed to accompany his presence. Zuri arrived quietly, stepping into the room with a calm grace that contrasted sharply with Okachukwu's showiness. Her dress was elegant but understated, a deep green that highlighted her poise rather than screamed for attention. She didn't need to announce her presence. people noticed her naturally. Colleagues turned subtly to watch her move, impressed by the ease with which she carried herself. There was a quiet confidence in the way she held her head, in the gentle smile that suggested she was both present and completely in control of her own space. Okechukwu, unaware of her effect on others, continued his subtle digs. "Did you even help organize this event?" he murmured just loud enough for a few nearby to hear, his tone teasing, almost casual. "I sometimes wonder what you actually do all day." A few colleagues shifted awkwardly, unsure whether to laugh or look away, while Zuri smiled politely, nodding as if she hadn't heard. Inside, however, a steady fire was building. Every remark, every belittling comment, only reminded her of the leverage she held, the power he had no idea she possessed. As the night went on, Zuri floated through conversations with the same calm authority, engaging with colleagues, listening more than speaking, and letting her quiet presence speak volume. Okechukwu continued to dominate the room with his words and gestures, completely blind to the fact that Zuri's understated elegance and composed confidence were quietly commanding attention in a way he could never have anticipated. The contrast between them was sharp, almost electric, and Zuri knew that the moment she had been planning for was slowly approaching, one revelation away from turning the entire evening upside down. Zuri stood near the edge of the crowded room, glass in hand, and let the laughter and chatter swirl around her. She appeared calm, smiling politely at colleagues who greeted her, but inside, her mind was running through the plan she had been crafting for months. Every detail of this evening, every word Okechukwu might say, had been considered. She had waited for the right moment to make her move, and tonight, with everyone gathered, was perfect. She thought back to the $60 million business deal she had negotiated entirely on her own. From the first pitch to the final contracts, every step had been hers. She had managed meetings, handled negotiations, and ensured all legal documents were in her name. Okechukwu had never been aware of the scope of her involvement. He assumed she was busy with minor errands, or simply content to let him shine. That assumption had been her advantage. She had built something monumental while he remained blind to it, and now, the moment to reveal it was close. As Okechukwu continued to boast and make cutting remarks, Zuri let them wash over her without a flinch. Each comment, each sneer, only strengthened her resolve. When he whispered to a colleague that she does nothing, and was lucky to be tolerated, she smiled inwardly. He had no idea that his mockery was fueling the exact storm she was about to unleash. She sipped her drink slowly, letting the tension build, knowing that the contrast between his arrogance and her quiet power would make the revelation all the more dramatic. Zuri scanned the room, noting who might be most receptive to her news, who might be skeptical, and who would be impressed. Timing was everything. She didn't want to appear as though she was retaliating out of anger. This wasn't about revenge, it was about truth, about demonstrating her worth in a way that could not be ignored. The more Okechukwu tried to dominate the room with his ego, the more she appreciated the elegance of her approach. Calm, composed, and deadly effective. Her heart beat steadily, not from fear but from anticipation. She imagined the gasps, the murmurs of surprise, the shift in perception that was about to ripple through the room. She could see it clearly, colleagues looking at her differently, Okechukwu realizing too late just how much he had underestimated. Everything had led to this moment, and Zuri allowed herself a brief, private smile. The storm was coming, and she was ready. She raised her glass to someone passing by, nodding gracefully, letting the noise of the party fade into the background. In that moment of stillness, she felt a powerful sense of control. Tonight, her secret leverage, the culmination of months of strategy, patience, and determination, would finally take center stage. Okechukwu might continue to mock her, but he had no idea that the tables were about to turn, and turn spectacular. Okechukwu moved through the room with his usual confidence, shaking hands and patting shoulders, making sure everyone knew he was the star of the evening. "Yes, this quarter's deal was a massive success," he announced, his voice loud enough to carry across the marble floors. "I led every part of it, and without my direction, none of it would have happened." A few colleagues nodded, offering polite smiles, while others exchanged glances, trying to appear impressed. He basked in the attention, oblivious to the undercurrent growing just a few feet away. Zuri stood quietly near the bar, her drink held loosely in her hand, her posture relaxed yet precise. On the surface, she looked calm, almost detached, but every word Okechukwu spoke added weight to the tension that was building in the room. She didn't interrupt, she didn't comment, she simply observed. Her eyes met those of a few colleagues, and in those subtle glances, a quiet message passed. There was something different about her tonight, something that didn't match the picture Okechukwu was painting of her. As Okechukwu continued to boast, Zuri let him have the floor. She allowed him to brag, to take credit, to dominate the conversation, knowing that his self-importance only made the contrast between them sharper. Colleagues began to notice the slight stiffness in her smile, the way she seemed to weigh each word, and the calm patience that contrasted with his loud gestures. Whispers of curiosity started circulating. People sensed that she was not just present, but in control of something they didn't yet understand. She sipped her drink slowly, savoring the small moment of quiet power. Every laugh Okechukwu forced from his audience, every self-congratulatory anecdote he shared, worked in her favor. The tension was no longer just in her mind. It had spread into the room. People were beginning to wonder, quietly and subconsciously, whether there was more to Zuri than the image her husband projected. Zuri's gaze swept across the crowd. She could see the subtle shifts, a raised eyebrow here, a slight pause in a conversation there, as colleagues tried to reconcile the confident, composed woman before them with the version Okechukwu mocked. She let it linger. She let the tension grow. Each moment that passed brought her closer to the reveal, closer to a scene that would leave everyone stunned. By the time Okechukwu turned to boast about another deal, Zuri was ready in her mind, perfectly calm and fully aware of the impact she was about to make. The room was primed, the energy charged, and the stage set. She didn't need to speak yet. The silence, her poise, and the growing curiosity around her were enough to make the audience lean in, waiting for the storm they didn't even know was coming. Zuri waited for the perfect moment, watching Okechukwu continue his self-congratulatory parade. She caught the attention of the event organizer with a polite smile and asked for the microphone, pretending she simply wanted to make a toast. The room hushed as people turned, curious to hear what she would say. On the surface, she seemed calm, gracious, even a little warm. But beneath that composed exterior, every nerve was buzzing with anticipation. She began with a few kind words, complimenting Okechukwu in front of the crowd. "Tonight is a celebration," she said smoothly, "and I want to acknowledge the hard work that Okechukwu and his team have put into the company's success." There were polite nods, a few smiles, and Okechukwu's smug expression made it clear he believed he was the star of the moment. She let him feel that confidence, knowing that it made the contrast to what came next even sharper. Slowly, she shifted her tone, subtle but deliberate, drawing the audience's attention to her own role without making it feel abrupt. "While many of you know Okechukwu's leadership," she said, "you may not know that behind one of the company's biggest recent achievements, there was another set of hands, quietly making sure everything went smoothly, negotiating every detail, and taking every risk necessary to make it happen." She paused, letting the room lean in, curiosity sparking in the eyes of her colleagues. Then she revealed it. "I'm speaking about the $60 million contract that has such a huge impact on. I was the primary investor, negotiator, and person responsible for ensuring the deal's success. All contracts, all decisions, were under my name and my direction." The words landed softly at first, then reverberated through the room as people processed what she had just said. A few gasps escaped, and whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Zuri held their attention effortlessly, letting the gravity of her announcement sink in. She didn't need to shout or dramatize. Her calm delivery and quiet authority made the revelation hit harder. Colleagues began exchanging surprised looks, realizing they had been unaware of her true influence and role. She gave them a moment to digest it, her eyes briefly meeting Okechukwu. The shock on his face was unmistakable. He had no idea this moment was coming. As she lowered the microphone slightly, Zuri smiled, not out of arrogance, but from the satisfaction of finally showing the truth. She had dismantled his narrative without anger or confrontation, using only the undeniable power of her achievements. The room was alive with murmurs and astonishment, and Zuri felt the quiet thrill of seeing respect and recognition start to replace the assumptions and dismissals she had endured for years. Tonight, she was no longer just someone standing next to Okechukwu. She was a force everyone had to reckon with. Zuri held the microphone a little tighter and reached into her clutch, pulling out a sleek folder. "And just to be absolutely clear," she said, her voice steady, "here is the documentation for the $60 million deal I mentioned." She placed the papers on the podium, spreading them so everyone could see. The room fell silent, the clinking of glasses and low hum of conversation replaced by sharp, collective attention. Colleagues leaned forward, some whispering, some wide-eyed, as they realized this wasn't just talk. These contracts were real, legally binding, and all under her name. Okechukwu's confident posture crumbled as his face turned pale. The smirk he had worn all evening vanished, replaced by disbelief and panic. His colleagues, who had nodded politely at his earlier boasts, now stared at him in stunned silence. Murmurs spread through the crowd like wildfire. "I had no idea she handled that deal," one whispered. "All of it? Really under her name?" another asked, eyes darting between Zuri and the folder. The respect in the room shifted almost instantly. Whispers of admiration replaced the polite nods and smiles he had received before. Zuri remained calm, her movements deliberate, her composure perfect. She didn't need to shout, raise her voice, or demand recognition. Her quiet confidence said it all. She was the architect of a massive business achievement, and the realization hit everyone present like a wave. The humiliation that Okechukwu had tried to impose on her earlier, with mocking jokes and dismissive remarks, evaporated in the light of undeniable proof. As she straightened, her gaze swept the room, catching the eyes of colleagues who were silently applauding her accomplishment with their expressions. The shock on Okechukwu's face was mirrored by the rising admiration for Zuri around them. She had turned years of quiet effort and careful strategy into a moment of undeniable empowerment. Every whispered doubt, every sneer he had cast her way, had only made this revelation sweeter, more impactful. Zuri closed the folder with a soft, final snap, letting the sound punctuate her. This deal represents months of work, careful planning, and negotiation. And yes, it's entirely under my direction, she said, her tone calm but firm. The room absorbed her words, the full weight of her achievement settling over everyone present. Okechukwu opened his mouth, likely to defend himself, but no words could undo the evidence before. For the first time that evening, Zuri felt the thrill of turning humiliation into triumph. The energy in the room had shifted, respect replacing doubt, admiration replacing derision. She had claimed her space, her authority, and her power, all with quiet elegance. Tonight, she wasn't just Zuri, the woman beside Okechukwu. She was Zuri, the woman who had done the impossible right under his nose, and everyone had just witnessed it. Okechukwu's face was a mix of shock and disbelief, his earlier confidence completely shattered. He opened his mouth, stammering, trying to find words that could explain or dismiss what had just happened. I didn't know. I mean, you couldn't have, his voice faltered, trailing off as the room's attention remained fixed on Zuri. Every colleague present was now fully aware that she had orchestrated a massive $60 million deal without him even realizing it. Zuri held the microphone with steady hands, her calmness in stark contrast to his flustered state. Okechukwu, she said softly but clearly, you underestimated me. You assumed I was incapable, that I needed your guidance to succeed. Yet here we are. While you were busy taking credit for everything, I quietly made sure that this deal, one of the most significant for our company, was completed successfully under my direction. Her words were measured, precise, and they carried the weight of undeniable truth. The room was silent for a moment, the tension thick, before small murmurs of admiration began circulating. Colleagues exchanged looks that combined surprise with newfound respect. People who had seen Zuri's quiet intelligence and competence were now seeing its full impact. Whispers like, I had no idea she was behind all this, and she's incredible, filled the space, punctuating Okechukwu's embarrassment. Every attempt he made to defend himself now sounded weak and hollow. Zuri didn't shout, didn't berate him. She simply stated facts. All my negotiations, all my contracts, all my decisions, every step of this deal was mine, not yours. You doubted me at home, and you assumed no one would notice. But the truth is now clear to everyone here. She paused, letting the silence hang, allowing colleagues to absorb the depth of her achievement. The calm authority in her voice was more powerful than any confrontation fueled by anger could have been. Okechukwu's usual charm and charisma were gone, replaced by visible embarrassment. He realized that everyone present now knew he had been wrong about her abilities, and wrong to mock her publicly. Even his closest colleagues, who had admired his confidence all evening, now looked at him with a mix of pity and disbelief. Zuri's intelligence, patience, and resilience shone through the moment. She had turned what could have been a night of humiliation into a display of empowerment and respect. By staying calm and letting facts speak for themselves, she had forced the room to acknowledge not just her achievement, but the depth of her capability. As she lowered the microphone, the crowd's energy shifted fully in her favor. Colleagues were no longer just surprised, they were inspired. Okechukwu, meanwhile, was left to confront the reality that his attempts to belittle her had backfired completely. In front of everyone, he had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and outshined, and there was nothing he could do to change it. Tonight, Zuri wasn't just vindicated, she was celebrated. Zuri straightened, her calm demeanor drawing every eye in the room. She took a slow breath and let the moment settle before speaking. Let me explain the significance of this deal, she began, her voice steady and clear. This $60 million contract isn't just a number. It impacts our company's growth, creates opportunities for dozens of employees, and strengthens our position in the market. Every part of it, from the negotiations to the final contracts, was handled by me. She paused to let that sink in, scanning the room to make sure her colleagues were fully absorbing the weight of her. Her eyes met Okechukwu's for just a moment, and she continued, softer but no less firm. While I was quietly managing every detail, ensuring no mistakes were made, I know there were moments when my abilities were doubted. You assumed I couldn't handle something this large, that I needed your guidance to succeed. But the truth is, I didn't need it. I managed everything independently, every risk calculated, every decision carefully, and now, the results speak for themselves." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd, some in surprise, some in admiration. People were realizing just how much Zuri had accomplished behind the scenes. Colleagues who had always seen her as capable were now seeing the full scope of her intelligence and resilience. They were witnessing a woman who had not only survived dismissive comments and underestimation, but had turned them into motivation and triumph. Zuri smiled slightly, not in arrogance, but in quiet satisfaction. "What this moment shows is simple," she said. "True strength doesn't come from loud words or dominating others. It comes from knowing your worth, trusting your intelligence, and being resilient even when no one else believes in you. You don't have to prove yourself with anger or confrontation. Let your work, your achievements, and your vision do the talking." Okachukwa's previous arrogance, his mocking remarks, and his attempts to belittle her now hung empty in the room. His authority had been replaced by hers, and the audience was acutely aware of the reversal. Every sneer, every joke at her expense, was nullified by the tangible proof of her competence and success. Zuri's words landed like a quiet thunderclap. She had not only revealed her accomplishments, but had delivered a clear, universal message. Intelligence, determination, and self-worth cannot be diminished by arrogance or disrespect. As she looked around at her colleagues, she could see the respect and admiration in their eyes, the shift in perception that would last long after tonight. She had turned what could have been a humiliating evening into a celebration of empowerment, leaving no doubt that she was a force to be reckoned with, independent, capable, and unstoppable. Zuri stepped away from the microphone, her chest lifted and her head held high. The room still buzzed with whispers and murmurs, but now they were filled with admiration. Colleagues clapped softly at first, then louder, acknowledging not just the $60 million deal, but the courage it had taken to stand up quietly and claim her space. For the first time all evening, she felt completely seen, not as someone's wife, not as a background figure, but as a formidable force in her own right. As she moved through the crowd toward the exit, people stopped her to congratulate her, shake her hand, or simply smile with respect. Their words were warm and sincere. They had witnessed intelligence, patience, and resilience in action. Zuri felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that she had turned years of subtle humiliation into a defining moment of empowerment. What had once been a source of shame and quiet frustration had now become a testament to her abilities and determination. Walking out into the cool night air, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the evening lift. The lesson was clear. Humiliation loses its power when met with preparation, patience, and quiet strength. True triumph doesn't require anger or confrontation. It comes from letting your work, your vision, and your achievements speak louder than any insult. Zuri allowed herself a small, private smile. The night had been long, but she had turned it into a victory entirely her own. Her confidence was unshakable, her accomplishments undeniable. And as she stepped into the city lights of Lagos, she carried with her a simple truth she hoped everyone would remember. True strength is not in fighting back with anger, but in letting success speak louder than insult.